I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. Spring has sprung, which is why I'm wearing yellow. I look like I'm about to be pollinated. Now, spring has sprung, but are we still in a winter of discontent? Because with more strike action looming, I'm going to be speaking to Mark Harper, Transport Secretary, on the show to find out what the government is doing to stop these strikes, which are now threatening to disrupt the FA Cup, Eurovision, some people might say that's no bad thing, and the Epsom Derby. Also, I'm wearing yellow in honour of something amazing that's happened on the show today. We've managed to convince a Liberal Democrat to come on. So Sir Vince Cable, the former party leader, is going to be joining me, along with Tim Loughton. He's the Tory MP that wants a change to the immigration bill so that it can accommodate safe routes for children. I'm also going to be speaking to, well, who else but Sir John Curtis, Britain's top pollster, about the local elections on Thursday. And in a GB News exclusive, we've got the first interview with Sir Anthony Selden, the author of Johnson at 10, which is a great book about Boris's premiership, which is quite eye-opening for very many reasons, so we'll get into that a little later. Let's go through the headlines first of all. Sunday Telegraph has got an interview with Ron DeSantis. I support Badenoch in her war on wokery. The Sunday Times goes with Archbishop will tell millions, pledge allegiance to your king. The Observer doesn't go with that line, funnily enough. Instead, it goes with Starmer, I'll be bolder than Blair on public service reform. This comes with a policy announcement by the Labour leader about housing. Sunday Mirror, 150 million on security, hikes up coronation bill. The Mirror, not fans of the coronation, probably unsurprisingly. Sunday Express are fans of the coronation. King's solemn vow to serve us all. It splashes. The Mail on Sunday goes with we are all invited to swear our allegiance to the King. So as you can see, coronation is a big theme of the Sunday papers today. And again, that's echoed by the Sun on Sunday, Harry in a hurry. It's not the first time that's been said. This is about Harry maybe making a whistle-stop visit to Britain for the coronation, not staying long, no cups of tea with his nearest and dearest to discuss that autobiography. Now, let's bring in another writer, Martin Townsend, legendary former editor of the Sunday Express, my legendary former boss, and also the legendary former editor of OK Magazine. I mean, you're a legend in your own lifetime.
That's a lot of legendary.
I tell you what, isn't it just? I'm only saying that because I once worked for you. Now, needy monarch of the day. That's what we're entitling all of these coronation stories, Martin, because what do we think about this plan for the public to pledge allegiance to Charles III?
Well, I think it's very odd. I mean, previously it was a ceremony where some peers pledged allegiance to the king, and it was part of the ceremony, and that's all fine. The idea of the public being asked to pledge allegiance, to me, this just plays into a lot of the critics around the coronation, a lot of anti-monarchists who will say, oh, well, the monarchy's losing popularity, because this feels a bit like, are we as popular as we thought? Maybe we should find out from the people directly.
Does it seem a bit insecure?
It just... There is a little bit of insecurity about it, and equally, I think it also plays into that narrative, which is of a slightly vain king. I want to be loved. I want to know how people love. I mean, I'm a monarchist myself, but I think if you are a monarchist, you have to be aware of where the dangers are for
the counter narrative to that will be we need to be as inclusive as possible, and the idea of just peers swearing allegiance seems all a bit medieval.
Yes.
And second of all, I suppose there's this sense to which he does need some reaffirming, because he's got these enormous shoes to fill coming after his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who even Republicans struggled to find fault with.
Yeah, but I think that's part of the problem. I think this plays into that narrative that perhaps he's not as popular as the Queen, or, you know, that since the Queen sort of passed away 6 months ago, that perhaps sort of respect to the monarchy has slightly, you know, dwindled a little bit. And I personally, this whole thing about making the whole thing inclusive and diverse and all of that, coronation, I want a big feast of pageantry. I want to see some extraordinary ceremonies going on.
What about the cost of living crisis? Hasn't the coronation got to be value for money in these straitened
I
times?
agree, but I still think being asked to pledge allegiance to the King feels very Game of Thrones to me. It doesn't feel like the British monarchy.
Will you be doing it on the day, Martin?
Of course, but I'm saying that I think a lot of people will feel a bit odd about that, strangely.
Do you think people are going to feel odd about Harry being in a hurry? So we hear that the Duke of Sussex is going to come in on the Friday night, go to the ceremony, and then possibly leave as soon as the crown has been placed upon his father's head, because he wants to get back for his son Archie's 4th birthday back in LA.
Well, all I would say is that I think for any father with a 4th birthday sort of party looming, knowing what small children are like, knowing probably what your wife is like, you've got to be there, you've got to be there. I'm not particularly surprised by this story. I think if it was me, I would come in, I would do what I was required to do, asked to do my best, and then I'd want to go back and be with my
But weren't the
child.
royals hoping, with Meghan back in Montecito, that this could be the golden opportunity to... Particularly, I mean, I think William and Harry... That's in a different situation, that relationship. But Charles and Harry, clearly the King wants to bring him in from the cold, as any loving father would, right?
Yeah, but, you know, there's still that whole family pull. He's got a family now. I mean, you know, look, we all want to see peace break out in the royal family. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
No.
I think this is really becoming a bit of the heir versus the spare. It's becoming open warfare, I think, particularly between Harry and William. We've seen that with the whole business of this secret arrangement that Harry's claiming that they signed with the press.
Well, let's move on from the royals and talk about whether there'll ever be peace in the Conservative Party, because there's this extraordinary, we're calling it buried scoop of the day in the Mail on Sunday. Liz Truss told to pay £12,000 because she may or may not, or allegedly made off with some bathrobes and other items from Chevening, her country residence. What's going on with this story?
Well, this is very odd. I mean, I'm not a mathematician, but I worked out that you can get 165 bathrobes for £12,000.
Price per bathrobe in the town?
£65.
Right,
so I
going for the
think it's
high-end
100,
bathrobe.
maybe 180. But anyway, you can get a lot of bathrobes. I mean,
have you ever nicked a bathrobe? That's the first question.
No, I haven't. No,
right.
I don't.
Not even from a hotel?
No, I have not. I can absolutely say hand on heart.
But what's this? I mean, briefly, it's just interesting how this story's even ended up in the Mail on Sunday. Who's briefed this against Truss?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think also that £12,000 figure, that looks very high for bathrobes. I would question what else that £12,000 is for.
Soaps.
Yeah, possibly. Champagne, wine, maybe.
Maybe there's been a knees up or two at Chevening, and now she's picking up the bill, possibly.
Yeah.
Now, let's go to policy drop of the day. The Mirror page 2, obviously, is championing Starmer's We Will Protect Generation Rent. But Dan Hodges in the Mail on Sunday is pointing out that Starmer's mask will be torn away after the Greygate probe, and people won't like what they see. So, on one hand, I think announcements on housing are probably tick VG. On the other, the Sue Gray debacle is going to make him look very silly when this report comes out. How do you think Starmer's doing?
Well, I think announcements on housing tick VG up to a point, because I think this is another one of those examples where, yes, we'd all like to build more houses. He's talking about building 300,000 houses in a year. he hasn't, as ever, given any detail about how that's going to happen. We know that we still have Byzantine planning laws. There's all sorts of issues around land ownership. The idea that we're suddenly going to magic up, what he's done is, as in the past with Labour, we've had the magic money tree, now suddenly we've got the magic housing tree.
Yeah.
Which, so I'm sorry, but I take that with a pinch of salt. I think it's so easy for people to say, very difficult for them to do. In terms of how he's doing, I just still struggle to see what he's actually going to do. I mean, he's been talking to Tony Blair, apparently. One thing one could say about Tony Blair was he was genuinely radical, and if he said he was going to do something, he tended to do it. Not always a good idea, we know, as we know with Tony Blair. So far, I've not seen a single really practical thing come from Keir Starmer about what he's actually...
too much commentary and not enough policy, perhaps. But
That's
then
what it
they're
feels
saying,
like.
well, we're holding our council until 2024. We don't need to announce anything. I mean, the only thing they keep on announcing is that they're going to pay for everything with windfall taxes and then the stripping of non-don status. But, you know, where's the calculations? We haven't seen them yet.
Well, it's all very well sort of saying, well, we're going to hold on from announcing it. We don't want the Tories to steal our policies, etc., etc. I think a lot of people in this country are a bit fed up with these empty promises. I mean, he promised to get rid of student fees, apparently, in 2019, and that hasn't happened. And I think he's rowing back on that now. You know, we don't want people saying they're going to do something and then it just doesn't happen. And that happens time and time in government, and I'm afraid he's falling into that trap.
Let's talk about somebody else with high hopes for high office. Ron DeSantis has given this very comprehensive interview to the Sunday Telegraph. I mean, he's playing a great game of Tory bingo in a way. Maybe he's playing GBNews bingo, because he's saying, I support Badenoch in her war on wokery. He's also saying, I love Britain. And he's saying, I love Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, he's hitting all the right buttons, definitely there, I think, certainly as far as I'm concerned. I think the war on wokery, and I'm impressed that the Sunday Telegraph has splashed this story, actually, because I think that is a war that's going on very quietly in Britain, which is actually really very fundamental to the future of our free press. Do we really want enforced liberalism in this country? That's basically what woke values stand for. And I think he's basically saying, you know, Kemi's done a very good job of calling that out and campaigning against it, and he supports it. And I think most, you know, reasonable, common-sense people would feel that way too.
Although what's interesting about this whole scenario is, because of what's happened to Trump and the so-called witch hunt, he now looks more likely to get the Republican nomination, which probably doesn't suit Britain as well if DeSantis is playing this kind of Anglo-American card as strongly as he is.
Yes.
And equally, I mean, Biden can probably beat Trump, because it's overblown how much he won last time. He got 80,000 extra votes. It wasn't that many when you consider the population. Actually, DeSantis is more of a threat to Biden, isn't he?
Yes, he would be. Unfortunately, I think, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, Trump carries with him this huge amount of residual support wherever he does.
Yeah.
People just have fallen in love with Trump for whatever reason in the past, and will continue to vote for him and push for him.
And there were concerns about DeSantis being a bit socially awkward and perhaps not being quite forward. He comes across quite well in this interview. It's interesting that Alistair Heath, the editor of the Sunday Telegraph, has done it. So it's clearly like a big thing. There's 4,000 words in the papers. Is that the approach? Would you have run it for that length in the paper, do you think, Martin?
Yeah, I think it's a great interview to get. I mean, you know, just in newspaper terms, you get that kind of exclusive, you're going to put it on the front. But I do think he's saying some interesting things. I think that very much plays into the Sunday Telegraph, Mail on Sunday in particular, those two papers, and their concern with what's going on very quietly with these woke values.
Also, it's not bad for Kemi's PR, is it?
It's very good for Kemi's PR. Please, Michael Gove, her supporter. So.
Indeed so. Martin Townsend, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Now, Tom Harwood, GBNews' deputy political editor, is in Milton Keynes. Tom, we've got loads of great guests lined up. What do the panel want me to ask of my political pundits?
Yes, I'm here in sunny Milton Keynes this morning at a brilliant restaurant called The Greedy Italian. And just before we get to the panel, let's have a quick chat with the owner, Antonio. Thank you for having us. Firstly, the question I asked to all of the proprietors of the places we go to on Sunday mornings, how is business for you at the moment?
Business is very well for us. Obviously, the cost of running a business has increased dramatically, but with local support and a great network in Milton Keynes, we're doing very well.
Well, good to hear, and thank you so much for having us again. Let's speak to the panel now. We have Ethan, Sophie and Neil, three staples of the Milton Keynes community. And Ethan, you have been a council candidate in the past. Why not this year?
The last two times I was a candidate, this year just busy with family life and setting up and running a business. It feels slightly disengaged, which is a terrible thing to say because the local elections are super important. When people think about the things that matter to them most, like bin collections, school places, potholes, it's the council that has the power. But sometimes you kind of look around and think, well, what are they doing with it?
Yes, I suppose that is something that we've heard reflected quite a bit in terms of that disengagement. Neil, you are probably reflecting that as well.
Yeah, very, very true, Tom. It's very sad to hear Ethan's commentary, particularly with an insider's perspective. But for me, who I vote for seems to have very little effect on the outcomes, and the important things in the community seem to be overlooked at the altar of politicising things. So I will not be voting this week.
Wow. Okay, well, Sophie, I assume you will be voting this week, but you are perhaps more engaged in the local community in a less political way.
Yeah, so I write a food and lifestyle blog. I'm very in tune with local businesses and what they kind of need and what they want to see from the government. I did actually write to my local MPs last year about the rise in energy costs for small businesses, and got a lot of feedback off the back of that, and secured a meeting with them as well. So I have tried to use my influence a little bit in the local area to try and get small businesses heard. But I will be voting.
Yeah. And it is an interesting place, Milton Keynes, because, of course, it is a swing constituency, or two constituencies in this city, but also the makeup of the local council is almost split three ways. How do you expect things to go?
But I think, having been a candidate the last 2 years, I've been involved in the process quite intimately. I think that, and I say this from, I was a Conservative candidate the last two times, and I have a lot of good friends and acquaintances there. I think a lot of good friends are going to lose their seats because of the national picture, and I do think Labour and Lib Dems will either hold or increase.
No, I think that's what the polls are suggesting right now. But finally, what sort of questions do you have for particularly the government minister on Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary?
Certainly from my perspective, there'll be a hopefully penetrating question about the whole transport infrastructure in the UK, whether it's roads, whether it's railways. HS2 will no doubt create some interest as well. It seems it just happens rather than it's being managed, and I think someone needs to be accountable to the voting population for that.
Well, we will get back to your reaction once we've heard what the Minister and indeed the other guests have to say, but for now, back to you, Camilla.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Tom, and thank you for those questions, Neil. I shall be putting them to Mark Harper right now because the Transport Secretary, I hope, joins me. Good morning and thank you very much for your time. Now, we've got strikes again looming. They may disrupt the FA Cup, Eurovision, the Epsom Derby. Have the unions just simply been running rings around government on your watch, Mr Harper?
No, I don't agree with that, Camilla. On what I promised to do, I said we would make sure we facilitated fair and reasonable and affordable pay offers to the trade unions. Now, the one that was done by Network Rail to RMT, the RMT executive put that one to their members, and by a big margin, 90% turnout, a 76% yes vote, their members on Network Rail accepted it. So we've resolved the dispute there. What is inexplicable to me is that on the train operating companies, where a very similar offer, similar value has been made to the RMT, their executive won't even put it, for the third time, won't put it to their members. I think their members should be given the chance to have a say on it. And the same with the offer that's been made to train drivers. You know, train drivers are well paid, average salary £60,000 a year. They've had a fair and reasonable pay offer that would take that to close on £65,000 a year, should be put to their members and let their members make a decision.
OK, so do you think train drivers are paid enough then?
Well, look, they've been given a fair and reasonable pay offer, and I think, by the way, the targeting of these big events is terrible. I've met the head of Ukrainian Railways. I mean, Putin's been targeting Ukrainian the railways. Hundreds of railway workers have been killed. We should be standing in solidarity with them. The Eurovision Song Contest is not ours. We're hosting it for Ukraine, rather than the rail workers targeting events and hitting families who have saved up a lot of money to go to them. I think they should put the fair and reasonable pay offers to their members, let their members make a decision. I think that would be the right thing to do.
OK. Our People's panellist, Neil, there is asking you a question about the infrastructure of the transport network in general. We know that there are concerns over the availability of trains, of the price of fares has gone up exponentially, not least because of the cost of living crisis. People, particularly in the north, think they're not getting a good service. I live in a rural area. There are potholes all over the place. What is the government doing about all of these problems?
Well, let me try and pick up all of those, Camilla. So first of all, we're spending a considerable amount of money. So I've got a £20 billion capital budget, which we spend carefully across all of those modes of travel. Conscious that most people drive, we're investing in our existing road infrastructure, investing more money in repairing it. You'll know that the Chancellor in the budget found several £100 million extra to deal with potholes, and we're tightening up the rules around utility companies that dig up roads so that they have to put them back in a better state. We're also investing in our rail infrastructure, and we're doing that in a way that's affordable to the taxpayer. So I'm very conscious that transport's about keeping the country moving. So a lot of investment, dealing with inflation pressures, but also making sure we deliver good infrastructure and deal with the day-to-day problems that people face across the country.
But people in the north think that they're not getting good infrastructure. Out of interest, have you ever tried to travel by rail between Manchester and Leeds in rush hour?
So I think you're very cleverly asking me there about the Trans-Pennine Express service, which the contract for which expires at the end of May. I've got to make a decision about that contract, and I'm very clear I'm going to make a decision that's in the interest of passengers. There's a limit to what I can say at the moment because I've got to make a legally robust and defensible decision, but I've heard what MPs from all parties have said about it. I've listened to what the travelling public's got to say, and no option is off the table.
Have you ever made that journey, though, personally?
Not that specific journey, but I'm very clear I've heard from members of Parliament and from their constituents about the challenges that they've had using that rail service, and I'm very clear about it. I've had the managing director of that company in to talk through the issues, and I said I've got to make a decision before the contract expires, the existing contract expires at the end of the month, but I've got to do that in a legally defensible way. So there's a limit, sadly, to what I can say on your programme, and I haven't yet taken that decision.
I know, but GB viewers and listeners will be astonished by that. Do you not use the rail system in the north much?
Yes, I do. In fact, I was just the last few days I was in Scotland. I took the sleeper train all the way up to Scotland, and I use the rail service frequently to get from my constituency to London. So I'm a regular rail user. So I have exactly the same experiences as everybody else. Sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's less good. And I'm always focused with my team and working closely with the rail minister on making sure we can improve services for passengers. And just your point, by the way, about fares, it was one of the reasons why we did the biggest ever intervention in the rail system this year. Instead of allowing the regular formula to kick in, we actually held rail fares down, only rising at the level that earnings are rising, exactly to recognise the fact that the cost of living is a challenge for people. So we kept rail fares much lower than they would otherwise have been.
Let's move on to smart motorways. People watching this are confused because the government's decided to scrap any new smart motorways because they're not safe, and yet it's keeping the old ones. If the new ones aren't safe, then why are the old ones?
No, well, that's not why the government's decided to cancel new ones. Smart motorways, if you actually look at the data as far as casualties are concerned, smart motorways are actually the safest roads on the strategic road network. The reason why we're not doing any new ones, for two reasons. One is partly because of the cost, but also it's because the public don't have confidence in them. And I think it's important that the public are not just safe on our roads, but have the confidence to be safe on our roads, and that's why we're not delivering any new ones. What we're doing on the existing ones, and the two that are going to be completed, is that we're rolling out safety improvements both in terms of the technology, but also a very significantly larger number of emergency areas. There'll be emergency areas every 3/4 of a mile, so actually if somebody does break down, there'll be somewhere safe that they can get off of the motorway and have their car while they wait to be recovered. So I think it's that package of safety improvements which is is also very important.
Do you accept that HS2 is one of the reasons that you lost Chesham and Amersham in the by-election, and that you're going to lose more votes on Thursday because of this ill-fated and unpopular train project?
No, I don't actually, and I think it's a really important piece of investment in our transport infrastructure for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's about the scheme itself. It's actually delivering economic transformation. It's a big investment in capacity. So actually one of the things it will do, even for people that don't use it, frees up a load of capacity on the West Coast main line, enabling us to deliver better services, passenger services, but also freight services to get freight off of our roads and onto rail. It's a significant investment. And look, let me give you an example. Lots of people, when we were delivering Crossrail, moaned about the cost and the delays. Now that it's the Elizabeth line and it's open, it's very popular, and no one thinks that we shouldn't have invested the money to deliver it. And I'm confident that once HS2 is open and functioning, that's exactly what people will think then.
But you say once it's opening and functioning, actually it's not going to come to London for several years. What's the point in the rail link if it doesn't come into Euston?
Well, look, we've committed to having it run from Euston to Manchester. I have had to make some delays on Euston Station and on the middle section of the rail line, because I've also got to make sure that our plans are affordable for the taxpayer, and inflation is running very high at the moment. So phase 1 is from Old Oak Common in West London all the way through to just north of Birmingham. We are absolutely delivering that full steam ahead. That is mobilised, all the contractors are working on it, and that is being built. And if you go to Birmingham and you talk to Andy Street, you'll see the transformation that it's having in that city, and the government is committed to delivering it all the way from Euston to Manchester, and those plans are being done. Again, there's a small delay in delivering them, but we're committed to taking that railway line right into the heart of central London.
Does the government have the power to stop Sadiq Khan's ULEZ, which is proving to be more unpopular by the day?
It is very unpopular, absolutely right, but it is the Mayor of London's responsibility. The power to roll out schemes like that are devolved, so it is his responsibility, it is his decision, and my message is very clear. If you don't like what he's doing, then you'll have an opportunity, Londoners will have an opportunity in the ballot box next year to express that view very clearly. You're right, it's unpopular. I've had it raised with me by lots of people, not just in London but around London, but I don't have the power to stop it happening. It's a devolved responsibility. The Mayor of London is responsible for it. He is accountable, and it's for voters to hold him accountable.
Very quick question, Mr. Harper, which requires a very brief answer. We've seen this cartoon depicting the BBC chairman in The Guardian. It's been accused of being anti-Semitic. Do you think that depiction of Richard Sharp is anti-Semitic?
Well, I think the fact that The Guardian's apologised and has taken the cartoon down rather demonstrates
is it
they don't think it's
anti-Semitic?
very suitable. I just think, well, anti-Semitism is totally unacceptable, and I think if you look at that cartoon, there are lots of anti-Semitic tropes that are expressed in the cartoon, and The Guardian shouldn't have used it, and the fact that they've taken it down and they've apologised rather suggests that they made a bad judgment.
Thank you for joining me. Thank you for joining me this morning. Lots more to come, including former Liberal Democrat leader Sir Vince Cable. Stay tuned, don't go anywhere.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
Right, folks, that was a spicy one, wasn't it?
With us four, plus a special guest.
Sometimes she has to stick her foot in it. Sometimes she has to say things as they are.
Sometimes I think we should keep the refugees and send the pensioners to Rwanda. Then we'd be in a much better state.
Well, Benjamin, that is...
The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got lots more to come on the Camilla Tominey show today, including former Liberal Democrat leader Sir Vince Cable, who's going to tell me how he thinks his party is getting on. A Tory MP is going to tell me why he thinks we should be taking refugees from Sudan. And Sir Anthony Selden will be discussing his new book, Johnson at 10. All that after the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you very much and good morning. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The final evacuation flight carrying British nationals has departed Khartoum. Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden said rescue operations ended following a significant decline in the number of British nationals coming forward to flee. Nearly 1,900 people on 21 flights have been evacuated. However, there are still thousands of British citizens stuck amid fighting. NHS nurses across the country will walk out from 8 o'clock this evening in a 28-hour strike over pay. In a ballot earlier on this month, 54% of RCN members rejected the government's offer of a 5% pay rise from April. Great Ormond Street Hospital is among organisations where nurses have agreed to keep limited staff working after voicing serious concerns about patient safety during the walkout. NHS England is urging the public to use the health service wisely. It said emergency and urgent care would remain the priority. The head of global projects at Young Voices UK, Jason Reed, told GB News the nurses' strike is the wrong thing to do.
Just hate to think of all those patients and all those families who will suffer directly as a result of what the RCN are doing. If they really were concerned about patient safety, I don't think that they would be doing this. I don't think you could have a clear conscience to walk out if you're an intensive care nurse or a cancer nurse and say that it was patient safety that was motivating you. Pretty clearly, they just want to squeeze a few extra pounds out of the government, our money, of course, that we're paying through taxes. And so it's just not a situation that the government should give into and set a precedent for future strikes, that this is an okay thing to do.
But Emily Crawford, the assistant editor at Prospect magazine, says that nurses are putting patients' lives at risk due to being overworked.
If nurses have been so overworked and understaffed for the past few years, that in itself has been a risk to patient safety anyway. Last year there were 40,000 full-time nurses vacancies in England. If we've got massive, massive gaps like that, I think patient safety has already been at risk for a while.
The British Army has begun rehearsals for the King's coronation. Soldiers from all divisions of the armed forces have gathered at training areas across South London to prepare for the biggest ceremonial event of their lives. Soldiers have flown home from operational duties or training exercises from as far as Cyprus, Iraq, Kenya and Estonia to represent their regiments and corps at the event. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back to Camilla.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. I'm going to be speaking to Vince Cable, the former Lib Dem leader, in just a jiffy. I'm also going to be speaking to John Curtis. He's Britain's top pollster, to find out, well, who's going to gain and who's going to lose come Thursday's local elections. And Sir Anthony Selden, who's author of Johnson at 10. It's a sensational book, and we're very, very lucky to have him on the show for his first TV interview about that. Now, Sir Vince Cable, I hope, joins me now, former Liberal Democrat leader. Sir Vince, we feel honoured to have your presence on the show because we've been having a bit of trouble getting Lib Dems on. We went to the press office, we asked for the leader, he couldn't do it. We asked for any MP, they couldn't do it. So we've had to rely on you, a former Lib Dem MP. Why do you think the Lib Dems have got a problem with GB News?
Well, I would hope not. I know several of my former colleagues appear on your news channels. So anyway, I'm happy to be here. I believe in... I know your general drift of politics is a bit to the right of mine, but I believe in trying to put my weight in to add a bit more balance. So I don't have any problem speaking to.
Well, we're absolutely delighted to have you, Vince. Now, let's look ahead to the local elections on Thursday. What are your predictions? You've been in politics for a long, long time. Obviously, there's an opportunity to capitalise on perhaps some Tory losses. How do you think the Lib Dems are going to do?
Well, a good starting point is what the Conservatives themselves predicted. They said, we think we're going to lose about 1,000 seats. Now, that means that when they lose 700 or 800, they'll be able to claim it was a great victory. It wasn't as bad as they'd feared. Now, within that context, I mean, we know the Conservatives are going to lose quite a lot of seats in local councils, some of it for local reasons, most of it for national reasons, some of them to Labour, some of them to us. So I would be disappointed if the Lib Dems didn't get gains of several hundred and win several councils, of which East Cambridgeshire is probably the most promising at the moment.
And are you worried a little bit about your leader's visibility? I only ask because when YouGov polled people to ask whether they had heard of Sir Ed Davey, only 55% said yes. He's got a visibility problem, hasn't he? Certainly compared to you.
Well, anybody who leads the Lib Dems has problems between elections because we tend not to get regular coverage. When I was a cabinet minister in the coalition, I would get, daily publicity. When I became leader of the Lib Dems, it was extraordinarily difficult to get any kind of exposure. And it only changed when in the 2019 elections, we won a lot of council seats, about 700, then went on to do very well in the European elections, and our public opinion rating shot up %. We were then squeezed by people frightened of Jeremy Corbyn or anti-Brexit, and we got squeezed in the general election. But I think Ed Davies, in the context of a competitive election as we have now, is getting a higher profile and will get higher recognition. And if we do well, as I expect us to do, it will translate into better national ratings.
Can you clarify, because I don't know what it is, but what is the current Lib Dem policy on Europe?
The policy on Europe is to rebuild our economic and political relations with Europe, which have been very badly damaged by Brexit. I think we recognise in practical terms we can't be talking about rejoining in the next few years. It's not feasible. though there is no political consensus in the UK, and it's very doubtful if the European Union would want us back anyway in current circumstances. But we should try to rebuild connections within, this is a personal rather than a party view, but I would think that within a decade, public opinion will have swung so far that we will again be talking about joining institutions of the European Union, which may then be a very different kind of animal. But in the meantime,
so are you saying that rejoining the EU might be something that we would do if the Lib Dems gain more power? I know you're not saying immediately, but you're talking about in 10 years' time.
Well, I don't use the word rejoin because I think in 10 years' time, Europe will look very different. You know, Ukraine will probably be a member, countries from the West Balkans. So we'll be talking about joining a different kind of setup. But what the Lib Dems have done is set out a roadmap, building up the kind of close economic connections we had through the single market, the loss of which is now doing a great deal of damage to the UK economy. So we're not talking about rejoining or just casting aside the existing arrangement. It's just impractical, but we do want to rebuild our relationship with Europe.
Sir Vince Cable, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Lovely to see you. Now we're going to go from yellow to blue because I'm now joined by Tim Loughton, who's the Tory MP for East Worthing and Shoreham. Mr Loughton is also one of the MPs who has been trying to make an amendment to the illegal immigration bill. Tim, explain what you've succeeded in doing because you were concerned about the lack of safe routes, particularly for child migrants.
Morning, Camilla. Yes, so the bill which went through the Commons last week, there were two main areas of concern which I had. I support the bill. We need to be much tougher on those people coming to here illegally and the people smugglers behind them. But there are two areas where I thought we could strengthen the bill. First of all, we need to have properly defined, accessible, safe and legal routes for those genuine asylum seekers that we've taken in the past to be able to come here from places of danger, from persecution, subject to a cap, particularly if they've got links already with family in the United Kingdom. The second area where we have concerns is about detention of children. We brought in laws back in 2014 which put a limit on the time you could detain children in the Home Office facilities. I think that's right. We need to treat children sensitively and differently from adults. And I wanted further safeguards in the bill to make sure we did that, notwithstanding the new circumstances we had where we've got quite a lot of older teenage children coming across, particularly from Albania we had last year, but there's also a dispute over their age and the whole process of age verification.
Yes.
So those are two areas we made progress in the bill, and there'll be more progress, I think, in the House of Lords when the bill goes on there in a couple of weeks.
Are you confident with the measures the government's putting in with regard to age verification? Because you'll be familiar with some of these stories, you know, men coming in with beards and receding hairlines claiming to be school children.
And there's a real problem, and that didn't used to be a problem, but now about half of those subject to age verification turns out that they're not children at all. Now, that's a problem. Clearly, we need to make sure that those people are kept away from children. And there have been cases in the past. You've actually had young adults in schools, in classes, sitting next to young children, let alone in various holding centres as well. So this is a real problem, and we need to speed up. And the government's also brought in mandatory age verification checks when there is a query over somebody's age. So again, I think that will enhance the bill and the process going forward.
So with regard to the government's reaction to the suggestion about having safe routes for Sudanese refugees, there's confusion, isn't there? We've got, on one hand, Andrew Mitchell saying that there will be safe routes. We've got Suella Braverman saying there won't. What's the actual situation here?
Well, the whole point of my Safe and Legal Routes amendment was that and I gave the example when I challenged Suella Braverman in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee some months ago, that if I were a 16-year-old orphaned boy from an East African country with a relation in the United Kingdom, how would I come to the UK? Well, that scenario became a reality last week with people coming out of Sudan. And the problem is there are some routes, but they're very difficult to access. So they're mostly through the UNHCR. And if you've got people going to countries where the UNHCR is not represented, doesn't have some sort of operation where they can process a claim, then we've got a problem. And that's why people then travel across other countries, and ultimately some of them end up in France trying to get across to the UK. We need to see, first of all, how long this is going to go on. Because what we don't want to do is to have lots of people coming here from Sudan, when actually what they really want to do is to be able to stay safely in Sudan. And so we may need to be part of an operation. I'm sure there'll be aid money available for that already, into refugee camps and other safe havens closer to Sudan until it's safe for those people to go back. We do that regularly. We've done that with all the Syrians in Jordan and other places like that. So I think that's the first priority that needs to be set up.
Mr. Loughton, a final question on the coronation, if I may, only because you did create a little bit of a storm by tweeting a response to something Prince Harry had done with the words, "shut the F up." Now, I'm wondering whether you think it's a good idea that the Duke of Sussex is coming to the coronation.
Of course he should come to the coronation. He's the king's son. What's the problem with that?
Well, you said you were fed up of the Sussexes and that you weren't proud to be in a constituency associated with Sussex because you felt that they were becoming rather irritating.
Well, they were becoming rather irritating, and my constituents were saying to me, do we have to have somebody who keeps making these rather annoying and indiscreet comments and flogging books representing the ancient county of Sussex? That was my frustration. He is the son of the king. He is still a duke. He's entitled to come to the coronation. I'm sure his father would want him at the coronation, but I hope he doesn't give any more interviews about some of the things he's put in his book, and we can concentrate on what's going to be a fantastic, important and historic occasion next weekend.
Rule Britannia to that. Thank you very much, Tim Loughton, for joining me this morning. Now, I hope now to be joined by Professor Sir John Curtis, who's Britain's leading pollster. He's the Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. Professor, lovely to see you this morning. Now, please give us your predictions for how Thursday is going to turn out for all three parties. I should say more parties, but the main three parties.
Well, I think the first thing we have to bear in mind, Claire, is the baseline against which seats gained and lost will be measured. And it is a very, very different world politically from the one we now occupy. We have to go back to May 2019. We're back in the era where Theresa May was still Prime Minister, albeit struggling and failing to get her Brexit deal through the House of Commons. The Conservatives were down at 26% in the opinion polls. Given, therefore, how poor the baseline is, we should, and given that the Tories lost 1,300 seats in those local elections, we should not necessarily be anticipating very large-scale Conservative losses, even if the party ends up still below the equivalent to 30% in the national vote, which is where it still is in the opinion polls. The Tories are just simply defending a very poor baseline. That said, of course, Labour are now in a markedly stronger position in the opinion polls. They've got about a 15, 16-point lead at the moment, whereas they also were doing pretty badly in May 2019. It was a plague on both houses. That was the message from the electorate in the local ballot boxes on that occasion. But because 5,000 of the 8,000 seats are being contested in the small district councils that occupy much of more rural England, places where often Labour are not competitive. And if anybody's going to challenge the Conservatives, it's the Liberal Democrats. Again, a rise in Labour support is not necessarily going to translate into large Labour gains and certainly not large changes of Labour control of councils, because the places where Labour have a chance of winning, in most of those places, only 1/3 of the seats up for grabs. That takes us to the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats' difficulty is that they are defending a good performance in 2019. And that therefore, for them, making significant gains of the kind that Vince Cable earlier was wanting to suggest they might make, shall we say, I think it's not a claim I would necessarily want to make if I were them. We've got a little bit of polling now as to how people say they might vote in the local elections from a couple of polling companies. That certainly suggests that Liberal Democrats may simply repeat their 2019 performance. The bad news for the Conservatives, however, is that polling suggests they might yet even dip below how they did in 2019. If that were happened, then the 1,000 gains that the Tories have been saying, well, that's what might happen, but clearly are hoping won't happen, might actually happen. But the truth is that's the area where we enter a great degree of uncertainty.
And Professor, does what happens on Thursday have any bearing on what might happen come 2024 when there's obviously the general election?
Well, it doesn't have any direct bearing, and certainly we need to bear in mind that people don't necessarily vote in local elections in the way they would in a general election. In particular, the Liberal Democrats are much stronger in local elections at any one point in time than they are as compared with the opinion polls. So they got the equivalent of getting 19% of the vote nationally in 2019 when they were only running at 8% in the polls. That said, I think what we should be looking out for, not because this will tell us what is inevitable, but will give us an indication as to whether or not we are in a world where a Labour victory at the next election at least looks feasible, is whether or not, once we add up the votes, not looking at the seats, add up the votes and say, well, actually, if everybody had voted on Thursday, how well would the parties have done? If we look at what happened on that measure before 1997, before Labour marched to victory in the general election, Labour were double-digit leads ahead of the Conservatives on that measure. Before David Cameron walked into 10 Downing Street in 2010, the Conservatives were more than 10 points ahead of Labour in the local elections leading up to that general election. So the truth is Labour really want to also to be doing that equivalent. And that at the end of the day, I would suggest, is the real measure to look out for. Are Labour doing better in these local elections than they have done in any local election since 2010, which is what you'd expect given the opinion polls? And are they indeed performing on a scale that is equivalent to the previous occasions when the current opposition have managed to displace the government at the subsequent general election?
And do you think that migration is a key issue come the 2024 general election, whenever that may be?
Perhaps not as much as the Conservatives anticipate. I mean, it's certainly true that Conservative voters, people who voted for the Conservatives in 2019, are particularly concerned about the level of illegal immigration. However, if you look at whether or not those people who voted Conservative in 2019 who think that illegal immigration has gone up, how likely are they to say they would vote Conservative again? Well, it's around 50%. But the same is true of those people who voted Conservative in 2019 who don't think that illegal immigration has gone up. In other words, it's not clear that illegal immigration is the issue that is persuading people no longer to vote Conservative. Now, if that's correct, stopping the boats, therefore, may not necessarily be the route to getting those people who defected from the Conservatives back again. In the end, I think the honest truth is that what the Conservatives will have to do is they will have to persuade people that they are restoring the fortunes of the economy, including the consequences of Brexit, and that only if the Conservatives can restore their reputation for economic competence and begin to persuade voters that perhaps they can look forward to being better off, because at the moment we're all suffering a marked decline in living standards. Unless they can reach that point, it's probably going to be quite difficult for them to persuade enough people who voted in Conservative in 2019 to return to the fold to be able to form the next administration.
A quick question on the coronation as the service fast approaches, Professor. Did the royals face an existential crisis if there are so many young people now under 30s expressing Republican sentiments?
Well, existential is perhaps too big a claim, but it's certainly clear from the polling that's been released in the last week from a couple of sources, the National Centre for Social Research, YouGov, that support for the monarchy is now at an all-time low. It's frankly declined during Queen Elizabeth's reign. And it's certainly true that amongst young people in particular, there isn't a great deal of support for the monarchy. Now, the truth is, it's always been true that younger people have been less keen on the monarchy, but it's looked as though they've tended to get to support it as they've got older. The problem now for the monarchy is that the gap is much bigger, and that the current generation of younger people are particularly less likely to be keen on the monarchy than even younger people 20, 30 years ago.
Professor Sir John Curtice, thank you very much for joining me this morning. Now, Tom Harwood, our GB News Deputy Political Editor, has been in Milton Keynes. I've been asking questions on behalf of the People's panellists, including Neil. I did ask the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, what he was doing to improve Britain's infrastructure. What did Neil make of the answer, Tom?
Well, that's right. I'm next to Neil now. And Neil, did you feel that your question was answered? The Transport Secretary said that £20 billion was going into infrastructure and capital projects from the Transport Department.
I can't refute the £20 billion. It's beyond my knowledge. I would have gone back to Mr. Harper and said, well, where's it gone? Because there doesn't appear to be any tangible benefit, and that's an awful lot of money to spend without knowing and having accountability for where it's gone, because the people who use the roads and the railways really aren't seeing the benefit.
Ethan, you're nodding your head there.
Well, I was just thinking, I assume the 20 billion doesn't include the 100+ billion for the vanity project HS2. I mean, here in Milton Keynes, we have a direct line to London. I don't know how the extra 10 minutes that I would save on HS2 would benefit me. I think that money is better spent elsewhere on other projects. Even the reliability and punctuality of the line we currently have, I would rather see that improved. I've lost track of the amount of time I've tweeted Avanti West Coast Main Line, where is my train? So I'd rather see that money used to improve connections in the north than east to west.
Yeah, no, I think east to west connections really are lacking. But more broadly, Sophie, you were concerned more about sort of business and local communities. That wasn't really touched on so much.
No, I think my biggest concern is that whilst the government is spending a lot of money on large projects that are helping larger businesses, what about the kind of smaller independent businesses that kind of prop up our communities, and what are they going to do to kind of support them through this recovery period from Brexit and COVID?
Now, one of the other big points that was touched on, of course, was the coronation. And of course, it's not just the local elections that's going on this week. There are three big events in the week ahead. We've got the local elections first, then the coronation, and then Eurovision. And I just wonder which most excites you.
I guess the coronation edges it for me, and it was once in a lifetime thing. I probably won't be around for the next one. Eurovision is probably more relevant for many people than the local elections, if the truth be known, and that's the sad indictment.
And Ethan?
I'm very patriotic and I believe in institutions, so I'd say the coronation, and also from a business point of view, I think it's a good opportunity for communities to come together.
And Sophie?
It's difficult for me to say. I think my age group is probably less interested in the coronation, less engaged in local elections for sure. In terms of a long bank holiday weekend, I'm not going to say no to that. So yeah.
No, interesting that no one said the local elections. Perhaps that's not the biggest surprise. But if we come to now what Tim Loughton was saying, because, of course, this illegal migration bill is going through Parliament right now. It's a big, big bill. And Tim Loughton was talking about protections for child refugees. Now, Neil, you sort of were looking intently at that point.
Yeah, I think most right-minded people look at the issue of legality versus illegality without necessarily knowing what the definition is. But it's important, whatever they do, that the right people are protected and welcomed and sheltered, and frankly, that the wrong people aren't allowed in. At the moment, we seem to be letting everybody in and taking an inordinate amount of time to work out whether they're the right or the wrong people. That one points at the civil service for me, and somebody needs to take a position on that. That's probably the cabinet minister, I think, who runs that department.
Yeah, Ethan, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I think we have an asylum system that is incredibly overwhelmed and abused, which means that those that need help and protection are not able to receive that because the system doesn't have the resources and money to allocate to those that genuinely need it. I personally think, though, the bigger issue is the level of legal migration. I think we're so focused on the boats coming across and those numbers, but the problem is at the moment is that in the year to June 2022, we had 504,000 new people come to the country. Now, that's not necessarily a problem when you think about, jobs and things like that, but the impact it has on like GP appointments and school places and houses, it's really difficult to integrate that many people so quickly.
Yeah, and Sophie, do you think this is as big an issue for an area like Milton Keynes for your age group?
I think it's the kind of the nuances surrounding the arguments around immigration. I think, I believe that people should have a safe space to go if there's issues in their own country. I think the kind of messages that younger people are getting from the government is that it's not really being thought about in the level of detail that it needs to be.
Well, thank you so much for all of your thoughts on those interviews. Really appreciate your views here in Milton Keynes. And back to you, Camilla.
Great job in Milton Keynes, Tom. Thank you so much. Don't forget you can apply to the People's Panel by going to gbnews.uk/panel. Now, don't go anywhere because in just a moment, Anthony Selden will join me for an exclusive interview. He'll be talking me through Boris Johnson's explosive time at number 10 ahead of the release of his new book.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories. Right, folks, that was a spicy one, wasn't it?
With us four, plus a special guest.
Sometimes she has to stick her foot in it. Sometimes she has to say things as they are.
Sometimes I think we should keep the refugees and send the pensioners to Rwanda. Then we'd be in a much better state.
Well, Benjamin, that is...
The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Sir Anthony Selden. He's the co-author of a new book, Johnson at 10, which is out on Thursday. It's absolutely brilliant. He's also head of Epsom College. You've written a lot of biographies, but my goodness, this is a barnstormer. I suppose the first question to ask you is, having done all of this research and spoken to all of these people who were very close to the Johnson administration, was Boris ever fit to be Prime Minister in the first place? What's your conclusion, Sir Anthony?
No. I mean, I can elaborate on that.
Yes.
He was a pretty good mayor of London because he could do things that he loved doing. He loved opening buildings, loved starting projects, loved being nice to people, and all the time other people in the background were doing all the work. He loved the Olympics. The Olympics, he said, was the... He turned to somebody to his left and said, this is the best moment of my life. I don't think life will ever get better. I don't think it ever did get better for him than being Mayor of London during the Olympics. And he just couldn't cope. He simply was not good enough to be Prime Minister. And he didn't appoint people around him who were good enough, and he sacked some of those people who knew how to do it. It's a really difficult job being Prime Minister. Nothing prepares you for the job. You have to show humility, you have to know what you want to do, and you have to know how to do it. You have to be both a storyteller with a story to tell, which he never had after Brexit was done, and you have to be a healer. The best Prime Ministers are both of them, and he couldn't do either.
But did some of the revelations in the book surprise even you? This
Oh my
idea
goodness,
that he went around calling himself the Führer, that he was... Some of his ranting was quite expletive-ridden. There's quite a few references to the C word in the book. I mean, did that surprise you? Because presumably you had been familiar with him in the past before you wrote the book and had heard stories about him and, I assume, met him.
Yeah. So, yes, I mean, he is, I think, at heart, quite a kind person. He wants the best. But his vanity, making him think that he could be Prime Minister, was just absurd, because he didn't have the skills to be Prime Minister. He got the country out of Europe. Without him jumping on the vote leave side, then it could have been and would have been a different outcome. Boris Johnson with Dominic Cummings tipped that delicate balance decisively in favour of Brexit. So that's a great historic achievement. It's changed the course of this country, but he didn't know what to do with it then. I mean, neither him nor, interestingly, Dominic Cummings really knew how to get the advantages of Brexit. Many Brexiteers would agree with that, and you needed to be straight on top of it. But also he didn't know what to do elsewhere. I mean, levelling up was great. Who would not want to do levelling up? But he didn't know how to do it.
On Brexit, many people have referenced the fact that he did write these two opposing essays, one supporting Remain, one supporting Brexit. How much of an ideological Brexiteer do you think he is, not least with his work for the Telegraph in Brussels in mind, and the fact that he very much sees himself not just as a European, but I'd say an internationalist?
I think a real test, Camilla, is the true Brexiteers, the members of the ERG and other strong pro-Brexit groups don't recognise him and have never recognised him as one of their own. He always seemed to be flaky to them about Brexit. Why? Because he was flaky. He could have jumped either way, so he was right to the very last minute undecided whether he was going to join Remain. Now, Prime Minister David Cameron, Chancellor George Osborne knew, and they were completely right, that the way that Boris jumped would decide the outcome of the referendum. He jumped for vote leave for the Brexit side. Why? Because he calculated that would be a better chance for him of ascending all the way to the top. And he was right in that. It did. He thought it would probably lose. So when the referendum result came through in the early hours, you remember very well, of 24th June 2016, he was completely flabbergasted, and he was wandering around in a Brazilian football T-shirt and baggy short trousers around his home, saying, "Oh my goodness, what now? What now? We don't know what to do. We don't have a plan." And he didn't have a plan because he didn't have a plan, because he didn't think it would happen. So, you know, the tragedy, Camilla, is he could have been the healing Prime Minister that would have taken Britain into that new era, leading Britain into a totally new position, out of Europe, out of the EU for the first time for 50 years. He had the vision of history. We saw it on Ukraine, where he gave superb leadership. But he couldn't, and he's such a gifted orator and communicator. I mean, what Prime Minister? We've just been hearing Keir Starmer doesn't have charisma.
No.
None of the three leaders have anything approaching. They don't have 10% of the Johnsonian charisma, but they do have the ability to do the work.
The interesting revelation about the vote leave era, and particularly the day after the referendum, and I was there, I went to the press conference, and both Boris Johnson and Michael Gove looked like rabbits in headlights. They didn't know what hit them. But what I found particularly interesting is that you attribute Michael Gove's betrayal to part of the reason for Boris Johnson's downfall, because you argue that had he run in 2016, he'd have been able to get his feet under the table, he wouldn't have been handed the hospital pass, pardon the pun, that was the pandemic, and he might have done better. But you also reveal that when he was betrayed by Gove, it was one of the only times anyone had seen him cry.
Yeah, it absolutely. I mean, it was shattering for both of them. Only four great political beasts dominated the 2010 decade: Cameron, Osborne, and Johnson and Gove, and no one came close to them in any party, Farage as a populist outside Parliament. And the decade was decided by the interplay between them. Boris Johnson is a trusting soul. He was just devastated and could never forgive Michael Gove, and that was another tragedy, because Michael Gove transparently is the ablest of all his cabinet ministers. Had he appointed Gove as Deputy Prime Minister, doing a kind of Willie Whitelaw job that Deputy Prime Minister for Thatcher, who was so significant, or Chris Patten, Heseltine for John Major, you need to have a really capable Deputy Prime Minister and trust them. If he'd done that with Gove, it could have been a very different kind of premiership, because Gove, with his incredible industry and tactical skills, and then Boris Johnson with the big picture, the macro stuff, could have been, we'll never know, a real killer combination.
What sometimes isn't discussed about Johnson, because he is actually very private about his very public private life, is the effect of the breakdown of his marriage to Marina Wheeler and his relationship with Carrie. Is it accurate to describe Carrie as the sort of Scarlet Woman and the bad influence over some of his thinking? I mean, obviously she attracted some terrible nicknames when she was in Number 10, Princess Nut Nut and all this stuff. What's the truth of the relationship with Marina and its effect on how things went wrong, and indeed the relationship with Carrie?
Well, somebody like Boris Johnson, you can compare him to the great Conservative Chancellor R.A. Butler, need very strong partners who are going to put them in their place and not tell them what they want to hear. And Rab Butler, who was the greatest Tory Prime Minister we never had in the post-war period, his wife died, Sidney Courtauld, December 1954. He was a totally different man since. And in the same way, Boris Johnson, for all Carrie's strengths, he needed a mature, very, very strong woman who would not tolerate any nonsense at all. Marina, by the way, was significant in tipping him towards Brexit. So I think that was a loss for a man who, for whom self-discipline is often a stranger.
Yes. And how about the relationship between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak then?
Yeah, that's
an early
interesting, isn't
champion
it?
of Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, he decided to nail his colours firmly to the Boris mast back when he was running. But of course that relationship disintegrated over the course of time. How much of a bearing did that have on Johnson's downfall?
Oh, a lot. And no Prime Minister in modern history has lost a landslide victory, which Boris Johnson won in December 2019. Everyone, I hope, remember it was about an 80 majority. I mean, that's going to buy you 5 years of power, possibly even 10. We've been hearing from John Curtis about how hard it is, just earlier in your programme, to undo that kind of majority. And yet, amazingly, Boris Johnson undid it all, not the least because of his Chancellor, losing total patience, faith, credibility in him. Now, what's interesting is that Boris Johnson, with Dominic Cummings, knocked out the earlier Chancellor, Sajid Javid, who was opposing them, having their own ideas. Often a very tricky relationship, Chancellor and Prime Minister, but not that tricky. They got rid of him, and Dominic Cummings thought in Rishi Sunak there would be somebody who would be much more biddable, who'd do the kind of things that Dominic Cummings. He didn't particularly care what Boris Johnson thought, ever, but he thought, this is my man, and very quickly Rishi Sunak thought, no thank you very much, I'm not going to do that. Within 2 or 3 months he was his own person. He had taken Liam Booth-Smith across from Number 10 into the Treasury, now at the heart of his Downing Street, and they had very different ideas, and bit by bit he was manoeuvring to see Boris Johnson out. And at the whole time, but it was many factors.
Yes.
It was the collapse of, ultimately, it didn't help him, but ultimately it was the collapse of confidence amongst the ministers, the junior ministers and the MPs.
And a quick word on Simon Case, just because there's lots of stories this morning in the paper suggesting that the Cabinet Secretary must go. Just briefly on that one, Sir Anthony.
So the Times in newspaper in its top editorial yesterday drew on the book to say that there's plenty of evidence there to suggest that He doesn't have the skills or the competence. And he was another person put in by Dominic Cummings. You cannot, I'm the historian of the Cabinet Office, you can't have a Cabinet Secretary chosen because the Prime Minister's aide is going to think they're more biddable than the current incumbent. It dooms you from the very beginning. So he's a man of very considerable qualities. You'll know how well he did looking after Prince William. He did very well looking after David Cameron. He's got consummate skills, but the skill for such a young and experienced figure looking after the whole civil service, all those permanent secretaries who are much older and more experienced than him, at such a critical juncture in this country, I think has taken the civil service and the quality of central government to an all-time low.
A very final, very quick word. You've taken over Epsom College following the tragic death of Emma Patterson, the head there, and her daughter. Very briefly, Sir Anthony, how's the community there coping?
Well, it's a wonderful school, and thank you for asking. It's a wonderful college, and everyone is uniting behind doing the very best for the school and for the young people in it. So I've been extraordinarily touched by the reaction of everybody in the whole community and the whole teaching profession, state and independent, just rallying behind. It's a great profession.
Yes.
Teacher, everyone listening, become a teacher. It's the best thing you can do.
That's a lovely note on which to end. Thank you very much. It's a great book. Do get it. Johnson at 10. Everyone, you must read it because it's an absolute page-turner. Now, Michael Portillo, former Defence Secretary and, of course, my fellow GB News presenter, is going to be here from 11. Michael, now, in your experience, how much do these political books tend to get right?
Well, in the case of Sir Anthony Selden, they do tend to get it right. He's written so many books about Prime Ministers. I've enjoyed them enormously. I've learned a great deal from them. And as he's just revealed in his last answer to you, he's also a great educator. I was struck by some of the things that Anthony Selden said very, very clearly, that Rishi was working to get rid of Boris and that Simon Case has taken the civil service to an all-time low. Those are pretty hard-hitting statements from a man who knows what he's talking about.
Absolutely, Michael. Now, tell us who you've got coming on the show today.
Well, we're going to be discussing whether the BBC, under its new chairman, should be looking at something other than the licence fee, whether the arts should be funded by the state. That's following Sir Simon Rattle's speech. We're going to be looking at what happened at the University of Cambridge's Fitzwilliam Museum, where a Stanley Spencer painting was taken down because it was thought, after many years, to be racist. And I will be racing around in Land Rovers because the vehicle is 75 years old.
Very much looking forward to seeing you do that. It's kind of like a take on Top Gear, perhaps. Now, don't go anywhere because we've got a tasty generation gap coming up on, of course, what else but the monarchy. See you very shortly.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope? It's very much so. And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Is the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now it's time for the Generation Gap, that part of the show where people from different generations debate hot political topics. My personal favourite part of the show, by the way. This week, following the Guardian story alleging that King Charles's ancestors directly benefited from the slave trade, we're asking, is the monarchy a racist institution? Now, as we know, younger people tend to have a lesser view of the monarchy as an institution, as this polling from YouGov shows that young people are much more disaffected and more Republican in their tendencies than older people. Now, joining me to discuss this is Henry Bolton, former UKIP leader, and Femi Nylander, anti-racism campaigner. Femi, let's start with you. Are the royals racist?
Well, if we look at it from a historical perspective, it's very, very clear that what we're taught in school about the royals is not necessarily the reality, or it is part of the reality, but it's not the whole picture. Everyone knows, if I say divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, everyone in this room, everyone in the country knows what I'm talking about, Henry VIII and how he topped off. Well,
that's a long time ago.
Yeah, exactly. But if I talk about, for example, the royal, emphasis on Royal Africa Company, and the fact that both James and Charles II were both large shareholders. I think James II was the majority shareholder in the country, which basically transported the most Africans out of any country from Africa to the Americas in the history of the slave trade.
Although what's interesting about the Guardian revelations is they concern the Bowes-Lionses, and the Bowes-Lionses are actually the Queen Mother's side of the family. So it's not actually the royal side, it's the people who married into the royals.
But that's interesting, because that means both sides of the family have this link, because we know the royal side of the family is linked to the slave trade. They were the ones who signed off on it. Queen Elizabeth I was the one who basically gave a slave ship to John Hawkins, one of the first slave traders. But now we know that the other side of the family, so that's both sides of the family have this history, and it's not surprising, because the history of slavery is something which is linked to the upper echelons of British society. The British taxpayer, we talk about reparations here today, the British taxpayer has been paying compensation up until about 2015, but not to Africans.
So you want to see Charles III directly pay reparations?
I think that all of these families, that we can directly link the funds that they have today and the wealth that they have today to the degradation, the murder, the enslavement of Africans, should have to use some of that wealth to pay back to the descendants of the people.
Henry, what's your response to that?
I think what's happened over, well, since 1807 or so, is that the British people have realised what a heinous, appalling trade the trade in human beings has been. And it was the British people and it was the British government and the British Empire that ultimately drove the global movement to change and overturn well over 4,700 years of this appalling activity. But if we're talking about reparations, and we're talking about the royal family, what about the counties of Yorkshire and Lancashire? What about the city of Liverpool, Bristol, Southampton? What about Portugal, Spain, Rome, Greece, the Egyptians. Slavery has been going on for centuries, millennia, and it is appalling. And there's no way I would defend it under any circumstances, but nor would anybody else in this country. And what we can't do is take people whose agenda is to say what we must do is eradicate slavery and human trafficking wherever and whenever we find it in the globe, across the globe. We must eradicate it. It's appalling. And take those people and say, actually, yeah, you say that, but your great-great-great-great-grandfather did this, and therefore you must hand over some of the money that your family now has to pay for it.
Let's put that to Femi. I mean, you could make an argument that if you're going to be blaming subsequent generations for the crimes of their forefathers and mothers, then should we be holding all Germans responsible for the Holocaust? Should we be, you know, we could go around all of the different conflicts in the world and we could link somebody in Britain to those conflicts of yesteryear. Where does it get us at the end of the day, Femi?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you say, what about Spain, Portugal? I mean, there's links. If you look at Queen Anne, again, Queen Anne, who's famously known for unifying Scotland and Britain, basically signed off and got the UK what was called the Asiento de los Negros, which basically is what Spain basically used to outsource their slave trading enterprise. They didn't do much slaving themselves. They didn't catch much slaving. So originally they did it with Portugal, then they did it with Britain, and Britain got a monopoly rights, basically, to do slave trading on behalf of Spain. All of these European powers are interlinked.
I don't think anybody's contesting the history of this. What we're contesting, and what I contest, is whether or not today's generation that consider this as an appalling thing and would like to see what vestiges of slavery still exist, absolutely wiped out because we think it's appalling. You know, my great-great-great-grandfather operated mills, cotton mills, owned cotton mills up in Yorkshire. Now, I don't have I might have a nice suit, but I don't have two pennies to rub together. And I don't see why he, running his mills, giving people employment, trying to do the best for his country, his society, his community, and putting money into that community from which we all benefit now, you benefit as well. Why should we now, this generation, start paying? Who do we pay? How much do we pay? And where do we stop? Because what about these other countries? Why aren't you in China saying, sort your slaves out?
No, I mean, like I say, it's not just what I'm in the UK, because I'm in the UK and I've been invited to talk about the UK today. I have lots of opinions on other European countries. The point is, compared to someone in the Caribbean, you probably do have two pennies to rub together, because the UK is a much richer country than people in the Caribbean. And a lot of the people who we're talking about, I mean, King Charles definitely has much more than two pennies to rub together. But the point is, if I were to beat your grandma up in the middle of the street, rob her wallet, leave her for dead, and then give that wallet to my son, and then turn around. The police found me. They said they could put me in jail, but I say, well, you can't take the wallet back because my son has it now. And the sins of the father cannot be visited upon the son.
Charles, let me just interject with one question here, because I interviewed the head of the Prince's Trust for the weekend's papers, and Martina Milburn said, you can't say that Prince Charles has got a racist bone in his body. Look how much he's done for disaffected young people who are often from ethnic minority backgrounds in regards to the Prince's Trust. Doesn't that show that he is trying to make up for some of the sins of the past?
I mean, there's scales of things, and at the end of the day, King Charles is the monarch of one of the richest countries in the world. Is the institution that he represents have never apologised for its role in the slave trade, which I've given you a few examples of today. At least 12 monarchs have been directly linked to the slave trade, and kind of through his trust, and he's very wealthy, he can have this trust and he can have 10 castles as well. Doing a little bit here and there is not the same as...
Henry? What's wrong with an apology?
Because it's not King Charles who has to apologise. He's done nothing. He's trying to improve the lot of people living in this country and across the Commonwealth, and actually beyond. That's what he's trying to do, and he's got nothing to apologise for. You can't apologise for somebody else's behaviour. You can't say. You can say, I am absolutely, you know, through today's lens, appalled that one of my ancestors did X, Y, and Z. But I myself, I've done nothing wrong.
An institutional apology.
But that's not how you know that that's not how it would be interpreted.
The crown is hereditary. So why can't the guilt be hereditary? If the crown itself is something you give to your son because of blood, why can't the fact that I can apologise for the guilt of my ancestors also be hereditary?
All right, gents, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Femi Nylander and Henry Bolton, thank you very, very much indeed for joining me. We're going to be back next week with a coronation special. We're going to come live from Buckingham Palace at 9:30. But up next at 11, it's Michael Porfillo. Please do stay tuned for that. Lovely to see you.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nah, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Dubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News. The People's